both COMLEX and USMLE for Step 1, Level 1, and Step 2, Level 2. I wanted to be competitive for any residency position that I decided to go into, and I hadn't yet decided what I wanted to go into. And so I didn't want to rule anything out by not taking USMLE. I have my notes in front of me, and so that's what I'm reading. What I want to start off with is that you need to do what works for you. Everyone is going to have their own opinions about how you should study, what the best way to study is. And what I usually tell people is at the beginning of the year, when you're first starting to think about these board exams, listen to people, take their advice, but later you need to kind of tune everybody else out and just keep in mind that you have listened to all these people before, you've decided on what you're gonna do and what your study plan is, and then you just put it into motion and shut everybody out. Put on blinders and do your thing. While I was studying for boards, I didn't really tell people what I was doing. I didn't really talk to my friends about how I was scoring on my practice tests, all of that. Not just because I didn't want them to know how I was doing, but I also didn't want to know how they were doing. And not in a way that I didn't want to know how they were doing emotionally, because of course I care about all of my friends and how they're doing emotionally, but I knew that I needed to just focus on myself in that moment. And if you kind of take on everybody else's emotions and you're putting all of that on your shoulders, it's gonna, really weigh you down. Also, I know people that studied completely differently than I did, and they did amazing. And if I would have studied the way that they did, I wouldn't have done well. So really, this video is to give you another perspective of how someone else studied, and you take from that take from that what you want and make your own study plan. Remember that comparison only adds unnecessary stress. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't give advice to people or that I don't listen to other people's advice. Obviously, I'm doing that right now. But what that means is when the conversation turns, when the goal of the conversation turns to comparison, then the conversation is no longer productive. So we want to talk about skills and strategies to do your best, but we don't want to talk about comparison. So if your goal is to learn and plan and stretch your mind, let's do this. Ask and search away. But if your goal is to compare yourself to me or to anyone else, take a deep breath, be confident in yourself, and do your own thing. Plug your ears to everyone else's advice. So let's start with USMLE Step 1 and COMLEX Level 1. When did I start? So I started in January to take my June exams, so about 5 months in advance. My biggest advice is to start early, not because you have to do all this intensive studying for 5 months, but rather give yourself some time to dip your toes in the water and struggle with the material early before you get to your dedicated time. Just because you knew this information really well a month ago or 2 months ago or last year doesn't mean that you know how to integrate all of this information into multiple body systems. And so that's what this kind of 5 months is for, is to really dip your toes into that, thinking from a very deep and complex level. When your dedicated comes around, you're gonna want to be fine-tuning things and doing a lot of spaced repetition. You're not going to want to be wasting time on learning topics that you've literally completely forgotten. So I wanted more raw practice questions rather than repeats. And so for that reason, I did TrueLearn and Kaplan before I did UWorld. And I saved UWorld for the dedicated part. So if you want, I do have a discount for TrueLearn. It is, how much is my discount? Let me look. It's $25 off if you use code Nicolet.life, but I will also leave a link and all of that here in my the description of this video so that you have that. Throughout my studying, whether it was before dedicated or dedicated, I used practice questions from all of those question banks to be the framework for my studying. So I didn't like use the textbook or use first aid or anything to frame my studying. I used my question banks to frame my studying. What I would do is just let myself take a bunch of time with each question. So I would do a question and I would do it on untimed tutor mode, meaning that after every question it would give me like whether I got the question right or wrong, and that way I could go then to my resources like first aid, pathoma, Picmonic, Sketchy, all of that stuff, and kind of go reinforce whatever I got wrong, or maybe even if I got it right, maybe something that I read in the description that I wanted more information on. But since I didn't start like really taking this serious until January before my test, like 5-6 months before my test, I bought the newest version of first aid, put it in a D-ring binder. Like I brought it to FedEx, got it hole punched, it was beautiful, and put it in a D-ring binder. And then when I was doing my practice questions and I got something right or wrong or whatever, or learned something new, I would annotate it in my first aid. I also had the first aid PDF so that I could control find or control F and find what I was looking for. That way I could quickly flip to the page. Personally, I'm still someone who really likes having like a physical copy of a book. And so while I used PDFs for a lot of other things, I liked creating my, big, beautiful first aid book that was kind of my resource for everything. And that really helped me because creating that binder was part of the learning process for me, part of how I was learning to organize all of the information. Something else that I did was, let's say in one of the question banks, I like in TrueLearn or in UWorld or something like that, if I had a picture that I really liked that really helped me with an explanation of something, but it wasn't in my first aid, I would actually print that out and hole punch it and stick it in the first aid binder. Since it was a binder and hole punched, that's one reason I really preferred that method over the like spiral bound. But yeah, that was so helpful for me because I pretty much ended up memorizing like where everything was in that big textbook. So something to point out is that I did not read first aid cover to cover. I attempted to do so like the first few months that I was studying, and I found that very unhelpful for me. I needed to use it as a reference rather than as its own study material because I found like the way that I absorbed information most was through practice questions. So that kind of goes back to how I used practice questions to kind of frame my studying. Pathoma, that is gold. Get a subscription. I did not only use it for board studying, but for studying for classes. It speaks for itself. Do it. Sketchy Medical and Picmonic, both amazing resources for picture mnemonics. This is just like such an incredible resource. I never thought I would be someone who would use picture mnemonics until medical school, but they just help so much ingrain that information into your brain. Anki, oh my goodness. Even if Anki is frustrating for you to use at first when you first learn it, you need to figure it out. Honestly, that is one thing that I would just recommend for everybody. So it's a spaced repetition flashcard app. So every time you answer a question, you tell the program like how well you were able to recall that information. So then Anki will use that information to show you the flashcard at a further date. So like, let's say you didn't remember it at all, it'll show it to you in a minute, or if you like remembered it really well, it may show it to you in 7 days. It's a free app, but you do have to pay for the iPhone app. I would highly recommend it because often I would go on like walks and do my Anki flashcard walks, and then it would be like a break from studying, but I was still studying because I was just doing flashcards while I was walking. Supplemental resources. Okay, so I think that this is super important. You do not want to resource overload. And what I mean by that is if you have like 30 different resources and you're trying to keep up to date with all of these resources, you're gonna end up like flip-flopping through them all and not really fully utilizing the potential of one resource. So what I used my supplemental resources for was just my primary resources like first aid, Pathoma, and my question banks, if those weren't providing enough information, then I went to search for that information in my supplemental resources. I used Boards and Beyond, good old YouTube, Dirty USMLE is like pretty funny on YouTube, and Golden Audio, Osmosis videos. So those were all kind of like my supplemental. So on my blog post here, I have kind of like my average study day, so I'll read it to you guys. So like at 6 a.m. I would wake up, I'd drink my coffee, I would stretch and kind of set up my study space for the day. By 7 a.m. I would study for 45-minute intervals with 10-minute breaks, eating when I was hungry, taking a walk when I wanted to, taking a nap when I wanted to. Around 6 to 8 p.m. I would go to a yoga class, go to the gym, maybe run outside, have dinner with friends, just something other than studying. And 8 to 10 p.m. I would do Anki cards for review on my couch, get ready for bed and drink some tea, and then I'd be in bed by like 10:30 p.m. That was pretty much my average day. I preferred my day to be more fluid because like as you can see, because my description from like 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. is super vague, but I noticed that if I scheduled in time, then I was a lot less motivated because I knew like a break was coming, and sometimes a break would come up that I had scheduled and I wouldn't be ready for it because I'd be in the zone. So for me, just having those doing that Pomodoro method and then letting myself take like a true long break once I just hit a wall, that's really what worked for me. On weekends, I would take like 2 to 3 hours off on each weekend day, but I never took a full day off during my dedicated, and that is because I just felt like I couldn't get back into the swing of it once I took a full day off. All right, so just like staying sane, I signed up for a yoga class like a month before my dedicated, and I tried to eat very healthy, sleep enough. The person I leaned on really was my now husband. He was my boyfriend at the time. And really those things kept me grounded because this is not an easy time. Because I took both USMLE and COMLEX, I took them within 3 days of each other. In the interim, I did as many of those True Learn practice questions as I could, especially focusing on the OMM since they have that. Reminder again, I do have a discount of $25 off with code Nicolet.life, or you can see the link in the description. And yeah, you know, USMLE and COMLEX are very similar. So really, if you just kind of cram in that OMM stuff, you will be good. A lot of people told me to read like the Savarese book, and honestly, I tried for the first day after USMLE because I took USMLE first and then COMLEX 2-3 days later, and I just couldn't get through the Savarese book. So yeah. So also specific to COMLEX, you're going to want to memorize the viscerosomatics and Chapman points. So I'm gonna link some videos here that are so good for that. You can just like draw them out a million times. That's what I did. Especially before COMLEX, just like sit there and have a blank sheet of paper and just keep drawing it out. So, new chapter, USMLE Step 2 and COMLEX Level 2. If you have listened to the first part, you kind of already know my study schedule, how I don't really like to take like scheduled breaks. I didn't really like to read any resources cover to cover. I liked to base all of my studying off of question banks, and so that's pretty much what I did for USMLE Step 2 and COMLEX Level 2. My main resource were 2 question banks. I used True Learn for COMLEX Level 2, and I used UWorld for USMLE Step 2, and together both of those question banks were plenty. I honestly ended up using both of those question banks as their own kind of textbook. During my 30 rotations, I did as many questions as I could from True Learn, COMLEX Level 2 QBank, and UWorld Step 2 QBank, and for each of the rotations that I was on and for each clerkship that I was on. That kind of helped me like kind of get through the majority of those question banks before I even took my dedicated time. Then during my dedicated time, I reset both question banks and did them on mixed. As I was talking about step 1, I did most of my questions on tutor mode, but step 2, I did most of my questions on timed sets of usually 30 to 50 questions, depending on how I was feeling that day. Overall, I actually thought I did better on USMLE Step 2 and COMLEX Level 2 because I was able to get through more questions faster. And so, hindsight's always 20/20, but I kind of wonder if I would have been able to do that same kind of thing for step 1 and level 1 if I would have just gotten through more and more questions, again, repetitively over and over. So I did use other resources. I used Online MedEd and I used Anki. Online MedEd, I think, is pretty much a necessity for step 2 and level 2. The videos are free, they're super helpful, those speak for themselves. I didn't plan these in, but I used them, I just searched the ones that I needed to watch based on questions that I missed. For Anki, I didn't use any pre-made sets. What I did instead is made cards based off of what I missed, so the questions that I missed. And then I would still go on my Anki walks and walk around the neighborhood and things like that, and be on the Stairmaster at the gym, just doing as many Anki cards as I could. I felt like that spaced repetition, kind of like how I said it earlier, just the more times I could repeat that material really helped me keep it in my brain for test day. As far as practice exams go for step 1 and level 1, I took one NBOME and then all of the UWorld practice exams. I honestly didn't find much help in the practice exams because I'm somebody that needs to go through all of my missed questions, and you just don't have time with these practice tests. So personally, I didn't do more than just those. Practice exams for step 2 and level 2. I actually didn't do any. I actually did not buy any NBME or NBOME for step 2 or level 2. I just did the 2 UWorld self-assessments and then I called it good for similar reasons as I previously stated with step 1 and level 1. COMLEX specific studying. So again, I scheduled my tests with USMLE first and then 2 or 3 days in between, and then COMLEX level 2 next. And the first day I took the morning off, slept, took a walk, all of that stuff, sat out by the pool. And then I did Online MedEd's OMT review. I'll link it for you. And that doesn't take a long time to go through. You can just kind of put it on high speed and get through all of the OMT sections. The second day I did as many TrueLearn questions as I possibly could. So again, I found ethics and osteopathic questions were the best to go through during that short period of time. It was a perfect way to review prior to COMLEX. As you can see, I spent a lot less time talking about step 2 and level 2 because I feel like by the time that you get there, you already have this really great base of knowledge from step 1 and level 1 that you can kind of build on that for step 2 and level 2. I felt a lot more confident during the second phase of exams, and I did better. I felt like I knew my study strategy and how I studied more. So I think that just goes kind of into the whole do what you feel like is best for you, because especially if you've already taken step 1 and level 1 and you're now on step 2 and level 2, you already did this once. You already know how you learn and what worked and what didn't work. So take all of what I say even with a grain of salt and just take this as another perspective of something that I did, and maybe you found a few pearls. Hopefully you found a few pearls in what I said, but do your own thing. I spoke a lot and I hope I didn't just completely freak any of you out, but I do have blog posts on both of these, so my scattered brain is more organized on those blog posts. I will link them down below. And good luck. Happy studying.